I'm deep in the reeds, and that name is very fitting for right now because I once again find myself in a situation where I haven't been able to put out a new video because of how deep in the reeds I am. I happen to be reading through this chunker of a Victorian novel called Middlemarch by George Eliot. I'm having a fantastic time with it, but the book is nearly 900 pages long. I'm about halfway, so it's going to be quite a while before I finish it, and a while longer still before I have the time to sit down and do a full, proper video review like this book deserves. So, I thought I would make a video that I've been meaning to make for a couple of months now about this insane book haul I had, a couple months ago. I was just going into my library and I happened to glance over at the discard cart, as you do. The cart was overflowing with these pulpy, vintage, sci-fi and fantasy paperbacks, and they're all in pristine condition. So apparently what happened is somebody came in with their huge collection. Maybe someone had passed away who was reading these books, I don't know, but they intended to donate them to the library, and it turns out that the library's rules around here is to not circulate old books like this, so they just stuck them all on the discard cart. It was absolutely overflowing. I am talking dozens upon dozens upon dozens of books. I don't know that much about sci-fi and fantasy, especially the smaller named stuff, the more pulpy stuff, but I'd like to get into it. So I went on the Discord server of Liminal Spaces, who is a booktuber here that I'm acquaintances with, and they were very helpful in giving me some of the big names, some of the big titles to look out for, some rarities, and so I went back with a very big list to the library right when it opened the next day, and I picked what seemed to be the books that were most interesting to me, and I'm going to take you on a wonderful guide through these books that I have very limited knowledge about, and you can help me out. If you know any of these books, if you have any awareness of the genre or whatever, then let me know which of these I should tackle first. I'm probably going to do a poll, so check the description for a link to the said poll to determine which one of these books should be the first one that I tackle. So, let's go through the books one at a time. First book off the top of this pile here is probably the one I'm going to be talking about the most, so why not get it out of the way first. It's Hrolf Kraki's Saga by Poul Anderson. And when I saw that there was a book by Poul Anderson, I got pretty excited. And then when I found out that it's an adaptation of an Icelandic saga, I was like, I need this book! Because two things. First of all, Poul Anderson is the guy who saved me from thinking that fantasy just wasn't for me. I had been frustrated with fantasy up to that point. I'd read a lot of the big titles like Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, and Dune, if you can stretch to call that a fantasy novel, and none of them really clicked with me. And then I read The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson, and I fell in love with it. I mean, it's under 300 pages, but it's so transporting, and it still remains to this day one of my favorite fantasy novels ever. But because I'm a little weird in the way that I read, I have not read anything else by Poul Anderson. Even though I read The Broken Sword probably like 6 years ago or something, I've just never circled back to reading him again. So this is a great opportunity to do that, especially because, like I said, it's based on an Icelandic saga, and I've been meaning to get into Icelandic sagas for a long time. Icelandic sagas were really famous in like the 1200s, 1300s, that kind of thing. It's where we get like the Volsung saga, Niall saga. There's just tons and tons of them. And they came from a really interesting place too. A Swedish Viking went out to Iceland, which was not populated at the time in like the 800s, and he sent some guys to just settle down there and stay there. And then suddenly people were like, oh, there's like all this free farmland up for grabs on this remote little island in the Atlantic, let's all go. So you got all the Scandinavians rushing to this island, and there was this cultural flowering that happened. And that's where Icelandic sagas came from a few hundred years later. A lot of them are borrowing not only from myths, but also early history of the, settling of Iceland. So, very interesting, very rich history. It's a history that a lot of fantasy authors have pulled from basically ever since the Icelandic sagas, including J.R.R. Tolkien. So here I find this, and it's a Poul Anderson. It's based on an Icelandic saga, and the other thing too, the cover art is gorgeous. It basically wraps around the front and back of the book. It's just so lovely vintage artwork. I just was so drawn to it before it even really entered my mind that this was a Poul Anderson novel or an Icelandic saga novel or whatever. I was just like, wow, this is a really gorgeous cover. So yeah, I am very excited to read this. This is probably the top of my list for what I hope to read as the first one of these that I tackle. So yeah, Hrolf Kraki Saga. It's not something I've ever heard of before picking this up, and I can't wait to read it. The next book we're looking at is The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. LeGuin. I put it at the top of this pile along with the Poul Anderson novel because they are the only two books in this huge stack by authors who I've read before. I previously did a video review for The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin on this channel, and I was not in love with the book. Let's just say that. It was decent, it definitely had interesting concepts, but I found it was fairly flat in a few places, so I really didn't feel immersed like I kind of wanted to be. Hopefully this is a more solid experience for me overall. So, Ursula Le Guin has a bit of a social justice bent to her writing. Of course, a lot of sci-fi novels always do have that, but, she was interested in things like the civil rights movement and feminism and things like that. So, it's, I guess, fitting that the book seems to be an allegory for colonialism and imperialism. It's set on this planet way out in space that is populated by humans. They're sort of these peaceful pacifists, almost like spiritual types of humans. I guess it's like a colony of hippies, and they get invaded by this other force from space and just destroyed. And they're defenseless. It's really bad for them, and they have to learn very quickly how to band together and fight. And it just happens that they have some kind of magical spiritual ability concerning dreams and deeper consciousness and things like that, so it already feels like an acid trip, which really goes hand in hand with this beautiful cover art here, which really gives sort of this Gaia, Mother Earth vibe. I think it's going to be another sort of deep dive into these sort of social issues or these political issues that are close to Ursula Le Guin, and it also, interestingly, has something to do with dreaming and the deeper consciousness. In The Lathe of Heaven, that was a central aspect of the plot, and it turned out to be sort of like this metaphor for Taoist spirituality. So I'm assuming that that's going to be a through line in this novel as well. I'm curious to read it and give Ursula Le Guin another chance. Hopefully I end up really enjoying it because I have a friend who is just ravenous for Ursula Le Guin. I really would like to get to the point where I can appreciate Ursula Le Guin like her fans can. So wish me luck when I finally get around to reading The Word for World is Forest. Now that we're past the books that are by authors I've read before, I'm probably going to start flying through these a lot quicker. But anyway, next book up is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I'm kind of disappointed in myself that I've never read anything by Ray Bradbury because he very famously wrote Fahrenheit 451, which is considered a pillar of the dystopian future genre of sci-fi. And so The Martian Chronicles, I guess, is going to be the first thing I read by him, probably. It's about the colonization of Mars. I don't know much about it. All I know is that Ray Bradbury is like a titan of sci-fi and, I guess, fantasy novels. So I'm excited to try him. And it's funny, the cover of this book just has a portrait of Ray Bradbury as like the central focus of it. That seems like a very strange choice to me, but anyway, I'm curious, don't know much about it. Colonizing Mars, I know other authors have tackled this since then, like the Red Mars trilogy or whatever that one's called. I love the idea of going into space within like our own neighborhood, like the moon, Mars, things like that. I used to just drool over space probes like the Voyager 1 and 2 and things like that when I was a kid. So hopefully it'll really sort of feel nostalgic and tap into my childhood love of outer space. Next up, we have two novels by a sort of cult hero of the sci-fi genre. That is Samuel R. Delany. He's not like one of the first names that a lot of people think of, but his fans will call him one of the best of the genre, or at least that's how it seems to me. And I've had him on my radar for a while because Liminal Spaces and Literally Books, two booktubers that I'm friends with, have both done reviews for this novel, which is called Babel 17. And this book is, as the title suggests, a lot about language. There's this interstellar war going on, and into this mix gets thrown this communications weapon that's meant to scramble all these languages and make it impossible for people within these alliance networks to communicate with each other. And the communications weapon is Babel 17. They have to find a way to stop it, and it sounds a lot like the Enigma machine during World War II, where they have to like break this code and figure out how it works in order to save the day or whatever. And so they get this entity who has this supernatural understanding of all languages in the universe to help take it down or whatever. So as far as I know, this book has a lot to do with like breaking down language and culture around language and how it affects us psychologically and all of these sort of cerebral things. It's like the perfect subject for science fiction. So I'm very curious to know why people that I respect have gushed so much about this novel. So hopefully I'm one of the people who like Samuel Delany, but I hear his writing style is very polarizing. So part of me is a little worried that I'm going to be one of the ones who just can't stand this guy, but we will see. The other book I found by Delany is called Triton. It's sometimes also called Trouble on Triton, so I guess you can find it under either title. And this is a little weird fact about me, but my fixation on outer space, I had a few topics that for some reason I just gravitated towards, and one of those topics was the many moons of the gas and ice giant planets. And I know from that Triton is the most well-known moon of Neptune, and so I'm like, oh, there's a book named after Triton? Ooh, I want this. It is a far-flung future where human beings have spread out around the solar system, but it turns out that the people on Triton specifically have got society figured out. They have made a utopia somehow, the society is perfect and wonderful, and not a thing could go wrong until Earth declares war on them. Apparently Earth has gone a little rogue and is launching wars against all of these outer areas of the solar system. I'm not sure why. And Triton is in the crosshairs. And in the middle of that, we get all this introspective character stuff going on, I guess. A main character who's trying to find himself. I looked up some reviews online, and apparently there's a lot of interesting stuff in this book about gender and the ability to change your gender and change your sex, and like looking into equality from this sort of insider perspective of somebody who can change from male to female to something in between and things like that. So hey, it might be sort of thoroughly modern in a lot of ways, although I'm sure it will be very dated in other ways, so we'll see. Hopefully I end up really enjoying both of these novels. But moving on. At this point, you're probably noticing that almost all of these are science fiction. I guess that's something that I should have specified at the start. Although, fantasy is worming its way into a few of these stories, for sure. There's a little bit of a magical science fiction thing going on. And that seems to be the case with this next novel. It's called Tunnel in the Sky by Robert Heinlein. Again, this is another author that I am aware of, but only in the most peripheral way in this case. All I know about him is he wrote Starship Troopers. I haven't seen the movie or read the book. All I know is it's sort of like got this ironic twist on the idea that humans are always the good guys. And anyway, Tunnel in the Sky seems to be a little bit magical in that it's a book where people are kind of shoved through portals that just spit them out on a random planet. Who knows what the climate's going to be, and I think it even alludes to the idea that sometimes it puts them forward or backward in time as well. I don't know how that's going to work. I can think of so many funky ideas or could go in. And it's one of those vintage pulpy sci-fi synopses on the back where it's just like, you must go through this portal, who knows where you'll come out, ooh, and that's all it gives you, and you're like, oh, okay. So curious to read it. Seems like this is going to be one of the more pulpy stories that I have in the stack, or that's the impression I get anyway. It's probably not exactly a priority in this stack here, but, you know, I'm sure I'll get to it eventually. You might have noticed that the next 4 books on this stack all have the same bright yellow spine, and I was totally out of the loop on this, but thank goodness I'm friends with Liminal Spaces and other people who can set me straight. Apparently, within the science fiction publishing world, there was a publishing company called DAW Books that was really important in getting science fiction out there during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I think. We're going to make them available widely, we're going to make them cheap, we're going to give them excellent artwork, and so DAW became a really big name, and they became very collectible. The other thing about DAW is they would number each book that they published under their name, at least in the earlier years, and sometimes they would republish a book that was a very good seller, and they would give it a new number and a new cover painting as well, and that seems to be the case with this one. It's called Polymath by John Brunner, and I think it was published something like 4 or 5 separate times by DAW Books, and each time it was given a new cover artwork, and I am glad that this is the one that I happened to cross my path, because the artwork on this is fantastic. It's one of those cover paintings I would love to just do a high-res scan of and do a big print to put on my wall. I'm kind of interested in the premise too, although that wasn't the reason I picked it up. It was judging the book by the cover. But the premise is that it's, you know, far in the future, of course, and humans are traversing the solar system, of course, and this ship has to crash land. There's an emergency on board. They crash onto this planet. In this crew that have crashed on the planet, there's someone called a polymath. In this universe, polymaths are people who learn all there is to know about certain planets so that those planets can be settled by human beings and made habitable. It just so happens, though, that the polymath on this ship is only a student. He's not fully qualified yet, and he was studying in an entirely different type of planet. So he has to basically start from scratch, and the clock is ticking to survive here, to figure out what they need to do to not die on this strange new planet. He's apparently like this super genius and ooh, so crazy with the numbers and the I know everything, so he might be a really irritating main character. I have a sneaking suspicion. It seems like this one is going to be a little bit zany. I mean, if the cover is anything to go by, but I'm curious to read my first DAW book and say that I also know what a DAW book is and care to collect them. That's Polymath out of the way. Let's move on to the next DAW book, Tactics of Mistake by Gordon R. Dickson. It seems to be another interplanetary future where humans are on planets all around the galaxy, but they're originating from Earth, and on Earth there are these 2 superpowers that are vying for ultimate control, and instead of having the war on Earth, they're fighting these proxy wars on all of these outer planets. So it seems to be a little bit of a similarity or allegory for the Cold War, with all of its proxy wars in places like Vietnam or Afghanistan or Korea. So that's probably what is the social relevance for this book. So it's interesting when I can sort of already pick up on a little bit of a social commentary going on before I even get into the book. That's what's making me curious, but I'll be honest, the reason I picked this up is because, you know, I was told to look for low-number DAW books as being particularly hard to find, especially in good condition, and this just so happens to be pretty much pristine. Like I said, the spine isn't even cracked on this thing, okay? I don't have the highest hopes for it being like a knockout masterpiece. I've never even heard of this author before, but hey, you know, I could always be surprised, and if I am not that keen on it, maybe I can pass it on to somebody who appreciates DAW books a little more. But anyway, that's Tactics of Mistake. Now, I hope you don't start to think that I had mercenary motivations behind some of my picks from the library cart, but I have to admit it. These next two books I got solely because somebody told me to specifically look out for Tanith Lee books that are published under DAW, because those are apparently fairly sought after, pretty collectible, so I saw exactly those kinds of books and I just grabbed them without really knowing anything about them. Both of them are Sword and Planet books, which is basically they're fantasy novels set far in the deep reaches of space. So you'll have things like spaceships and ray guns and aliens and things like that. But it's mostly a fantasy novel with wizards and swords and all of the familiar trappings. Probably kind of like Dune, but with a little bit more of a medieval pastiche is the sense that I get. But I don't know for sure because I've never read a Sword and Planet book, unless you count Dune, I guess. The two books by Tanith Lee that I got are The Storm Lord and Quest for the Witch. The Storm Lord is about this guy who his mother was assaulted and that's where he was born from, and then she was killed tragically, and he wants to find out where he comes from, who his father is, and slowly starts to learn that revenge is on the menu, and he starts, you know, going after all the answers that he wants about himself, but also, I guess, kicking ass and taking names. And of course, the cover is very racy. It's like a straight up naked woman, pretty much, being protected by the sword, held by a guy who's very brawny, and I'm sure Freud would have a lot to say about that snake in the background, but it's a little bit charming. I mean, say what you will about the male gaze, but seeing it in antiquated, pulpy books like this, it's always a little bit funny to me. So yeah, I'm definitely curious to see just how trashy this book can get, if the cover is anything to go by. The second book seems to be pretty similar. Again, intergenerational revenge story, except this time the big burly strong man wants to get revenge on his own mother and kill her, because apparently his mother was a witch who's responsible for all of these terrible deeds, but his father was this warrior king and he's named after him and all this stuff. So again, same sort of thing going on. Now the problem with these two books, and the problem with a lot of pulpy sci-fi or fantasy, is that I'm not really that big into series. I way prefer standalone novels, and the other thing is, with them being this old, you don't usually find the first book in the series first. So, The Storm Lord, thankfully, is the first novel in a larger series, so at least I'll be starting at the beginning. But the problem with Quest for the Witch is that I think it's like the third or fourth book in a bigger series, so that kind of puts me off. I'm a little bit OCD about this, I guess, but I can't not read the first book first. So, even though it probably isn't that important, I mean, these books were meant to be picked up and read by just anyone, right? So I'm sure it does a good job of, like, getting the reader up to speed, even if you jump in the middle. But even in spite of that, I'm still like, no, I must read the first book first. So anyway, I'll read this book. I'm not sure what I'll do with this one, but either way, whether I like these or not, I'm sure I will pass them on to someone who is a lot more knowledgeable and appreciative of this kind of writing. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure how to talk about this next swath of books here, because they're all by the same author. The author is Michael Moorcock, and Michael Moorcock, if you don't know, wrote the Elric saga of books, but he's also best known for just writing a shit ton of books in general, whether it's sci-fi or fantasy. It seems like it was mostly fantasy. This guy just wrote novel upon novel upon novel, just extremely prolific, and he's been writing for decades. He was writing when Tolkien was writing, okay? And he's still alive now. So he has all of these different series, and they're all commingling together. Apparently, he often gets credited with creating the idea of multiverses in stories, and the way that his stories kind of fold into one another. It's a mess. So for anyone who's looking to get into him, it's kind of frickin' intimidating. And there were a lot of books there that were just scraps and pieces of his many different series. For example, in one shot, I almost completed the entire Rune Staff series. I thought I had all three, because at the top of the book it says, first volume in the history of Rune Staff, second volume in history of Rune Staff, and final volume, fourth and final. And I thought I had the third one until I looked closer and I saw, oh, it's the third volume of another series. Shit! But anyway, so, you know, I now have bits and pieces like the first book of Corum. This is apparently one of his Elric Saga books called Stormbringer. I only know about the Elric Saga because Blue Oyster Cult did a song called Black Blade, which I love, which is apparently inspired by the Elric Saga. So, yeah, it's just, I don't know what I'm doing with all of these books. I'm probably going to start the Rune Staff series. I'll try Blood Red Game just because the cover is sick. And then, you know, the Book of Corum, I hear his Corum series is very well regarded as well. So, it's a mess. it's a mess, and I really don't know where to start. So, yeah, but thankfully, I have a couple of standalone books by Michael Moorcock now, so let me just get into those real quick. So this one is called The Ice Schooner, and this cover is hilarious. There is what seems like a Viking ship, or like an old sailing rig or whatever, but it's on skis, and those skis are on ice, and there's a big half-naked man and half-naked woman in this wintry hellscape just posing in front of this ship on skis. Apparently it's about this far future on Earth where the whole planet is frozen over like it's the end of the day after tomorrow or something, and this guy has to set out for the fabled lost city of New York, which is buried under like a mile of ice and snow and whatever, and I don't really know why, but a perilous journey in a future world that's frozen over. Seems kind of trashy, but hey, hopefully it's fun trashy. And then the last thing I want to bring up from Michael Moorcock involves transitioning into books that I've already owned. I've had these two last books on this stack for quite a while now. Been meaning to get around to them, and I'm sure I will soon. And the first one off of that is also by Michael Moorcock. It's called Gloriana, or The Unfulfilled Queen. Maybe I'll get a strike on my channel for even showing this cover. But anyway, Gloriana is apparently loosely based on The Fairy Queen, which was this epic English poem from like the 1500s by Edmund Spenser, which is something that I've wanted to read, but I know it's probably way too over my head at this point. So might as well read a sort of modernized fantasy reimagining of that book. And the book is, of course, you know, The Fairy Queen is based in turn upon Queen Elizabeth I, I think. I can't remember. It's based on like this 1500s queen who is considered all virginal and innocent and unable to cope with the burden of being a monarch and all this stuff. But the book, The Fairy Queen and Gloriana, both explore this idea of learning to be a leader, learning to be a formidable person through exploring your sexuality. Now, obviously, I've just dug through a whole pile of pulp fiction, so I don't know whether or not this novel is going to do that kind of subject matter justice. I am hoping that it's a little bit literary, a little bit thought-provoking, and a little bit more than just racy, gratuitous sex. I'm hoping that that's not what this book is. But I'm also a little worried that gratuitous sex catered to the male gaze is exactly what this book is going to be. So we'll have to see. But the reason that this book was put on my radar, the reason I've had it for all this time, is that I stumbled across this list years ago that was like a recommendation list of like the best underrated fantasy novels that a lot of people haven't heard of or whatever. And I started reading a few books off the list, and every book hit with me. I'm picky when it comes to fantasy. A lot of the big famous fantasy novels don't do anything for me. So when I read Broken Sword, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, The Worm Ouroboros, all from that list, and I liked every one of those books. I was like, holy shit, this list has got it going on. This is like, it was written for me. And so I've been slowly making my way through every book that's recommended on that list. And Gloriana was one of them. It just so happened that Gloriana seems to be the most difficult one to find in the wild, so I had to order it online. But this is the year that I intend to get to Gloriana. I also intend it to be the first book I read by Michael Moorcock, which is a strange place to start with him apparently, because I've talked to a lot of Michael Moorcock fans, and a lot of them haven't even heard of this book. I haven't encountered any that have even read it. So it seems a little strange that the first Moorcock book I'm going to read is not an Elric book. It's not one of his better known books by any means, but who knows, maybe this will be a diamond in the rough. It always seems like the fantasy books that click with me the most are the ones that are off the beaten path. So hopefully that's the case again with this book. I'm very excited to get into it and hopefully review it later this year. Finally, we make it to the last book on this pile here. It's Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson. Like Gloriana, this is a book that I've owned for quite a while, and it's another book that I found for free. I guess I just get really lucky and these books find me more than I find them. I found this in one of those mini free library things, so after I read it, I'll probably put it back in another free library thing. And yeah, this book is a very influential sci-fi novel, forerunner of the cyberpunk subgenre, considered very influential and eerie in how it predicts a lot of things that are very relevant to us today. It's got stuff that's kind of like approximates the internet, talks about AI, the metaverse, which is apparently now a real thing thanks to Mark Zuckerberg. Basically, it's this world far in the future where people sort of plug into this virtual reality where they can be whatever they want to be. And so this main character, he's a pizza delivery guy in real life, but in the virtual world he's like this big epic hero warrior guy who literally named himself Hero Protagonist. So already the novel seems very tongue-in-cheek before I even start reading it. And, you know, apparently there's a lot of, like, satire and political, social commentary, as you would normally expect with sci-fi. This came out in the 90s, which makes it by far the most modern book that we've talked about here today. It seems like something that I'd be interested in, so I'm probably going to read it sooner rather than later. Really hope that I like it, and, yeah, that brings us to the end of this giant list of books. Whew! So there you go. There's all 17 of the pulpy sci-fi fantasy novels that I found at the library for free, plus the 2 bonus ones that I've owned for longer. It's kind of crazy to think that out of all of these books, the only one I spent any money on was Gloriana. The rest were just complete luck finds, which is kind of like the universe's way of telling me that I need to stop reading boring literary fiction and history books and start reading exciting, dramatic, corny genre fiction from the 70s or whatever. If you've read any of these books, please let me know. And also, be sure to check out the link in the description. I'm going to put a poll on YouTube for people to determine which of these books I should read first, because I really don't know where to start with all of these, and I would love some input from people who know better than me. So I've narrowed out 6 books as the ones that I possibly want to start with. We've got Gloriana by Michael Moorcock, The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, Babel 17 by Samuel Delany, Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson, Hrolf Kraki's Saga by Poul and The Word for World is Forest by Ursula LeGuin. Those are the ones that I'm most curious about. The other ones I'm sure I will get to eventually, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books here. What can you say? I'm struggling to even organize them in one spot, but hopefully you enjoyed this video and me rambling on and on about these books that I haven't even read and barely know anything about. I will see you next when I finally finish Middlemarch. Who knows when that'll be, and then I'll be looking to dive into one of these. I'm very excited and curious to see where that goes. But yeah, that's me. I've been deep in the reads. I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.